Okay. Hopefully we'll have some more people show up, and if not, we'll have it to where they can see it later. So okay. So kind of where we let off last week. So last week we began discussing the two Leviticus verses, and with that, it's all basically one lesson, but split over 2 weeks. So last week we talked about how basically the book of Leviticus was set up to let people know that they or how to separate themselves from the other cultures. Because if you read through, especially Leviticus 18, it begins the chapter saying, "Do not be like the Canaanites and the Egyptians," and then it gives information on different ways that they can be separated, and then and actually anyway, so I don't have it all on this, but basically it was set up to where it starts out at the beginning. The Egyptians, don't be like the Canaanites and Egyptians, and then it builds up to the main focal point of the passage of the chapter, talking about the sexual exploitations that the surrounding countries did, and then it works its way back to the Egyptians and the Canaanites again. So it kind of sandwiches in the passage that we're looking at. It's kind of sandwiched in the middle. So basically, Leviticus 18:22, it must be read in the context of rejecting the exploitative sexual systems that were tied to especially those cultures of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. And we talked about that last week. We began talking about the word to'eve, which basically means instead of abomination, which is what most of the English translations translated to, it basically means a taboo or something that was not culturally accepted. And the word itself is used to talk about many different things. It's talking about things like the food restrictions, the clothing restrictions, the agriculture restrictions. I mean, so there's this huge long list of restrictions, and each of those lists this word toeve, and basically it means taboo or something that is not culturally accepted. And the purpose of this is the whole purpose of Leviticus, and we talked about this last week a lot. The whole purpose of Leviticus is to tell the people how to separate themselves from the surrounding cultures. And it is believed that this book was actually written during the time of the Babylonian exile, and because of that, there were a lot of changes and a lot of things going on in the area of the Babylonian Empire that basically the Jews wanted to remain separate from. And so that's the main reason that the book of Leviticus and then also Deuteronomy are used for. So, with all that being said, getting into where we talked last week, we ended the lesson last week talking about the differences between purity and morality. And the main difference between purity and morality is purity is a statement to keep the Jewish people pure from the traditions and rituals of the surrounding nations. Purity, the idea is, and they use the term holiness. Holiness basically means to be separate, away from, to be brought out. It doesn't mean the modern contemporary version of holiness, which basically is this moral superiority. Um, and if you go to many churches, a lot of times when they talk about holiness, that's how it appears as moral superiority. But in actuality, none of the words that are used for holiness in the Bible mean anything to do with perfection and for moral purity. Instead, they just mean to be separated or to be set apart. And so, because of that, we talked last week about how purity is basically the Jews trying to remain pure, trying to remain separate, their culture being separate, their identity being separate. And then we talked about morality, the difference between that and morality. Morality is the universal law, such as do not murder, do not steal. And while the universal laws are listed in parts of Leviticus, they're not listed in the section that we're talking about here. The section that we're talking about here, which is called the holiness code. Sorry, it took me a minute. The holiness code itself is strictly talking about the purity remaining separate from other cultures, while the universal moral law was the murder, the theft, the oppression, the care for the poor, treating workers fairly, slander, vengeance, and loving your neighbor. And those are more universal, cross-cultural things that basically every major culture throughout history, even from ancient writings, these were listed out as moral codes for pretty much every culture. This wasn't just a Jewish thing, but the specific Jewish things were the food and the discussion of the sexual exploitation and stuff like that. Those were things that were primarily Jewish. Okay, all of that being said, that's the purity laws and the moral laws. We got through that last week. We didn't get into what Jesus and the New Testament discussions of this. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about, or the Bible talks about, Jesus fulfilling the laws, and basically Jesus dismantled the purity laws that were set forth by the Jews. We read about it in Acts, in the passage talking about Peter going up on the roof to pray, and while he was there, he had this vision, and this table was laid out before him, and God told him, you can now eat, and he said, but all of these things are unclean, and God's like, well, what I call clean is clean, and so basically the New Testament dismantles a lot of these, all of the purity issues. Paul talks in Galatians about how the people were trying to force the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to follow the Jewish laws. And they were saying, you're not truly Christian unless you're following these Jewish laws. And Paul was very emphatic about this. If you read the King James version of it, he actually says that he wishes that they would emasculate themselves while trying to do a circumcision. Basically, just remove it all. If you're going to sit there and tell the Gentiles that they have to follow the Jewish laws, then I wish their hand would just slip while they're trying to circumcise, and they would just emasculate themselves. I mean, he's very, very, very strict about this. This was something that Paul really taught against. And it's interesting because in Paul's writings, he talks very highly of things like the Spirit and spiritual laws, but he talks very much against these fleshly laws that were given by the Jews in the Old Testament. And the Hebrews also talks about purity laws and how they're no longer binding for people. Now, as we talked last week, also there's, which we see that those all being said, the moral laws and things being brought up in Leviticus 19:18, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And actually it's crazy because most people had probably never heard that being an Old Testament passage. I know for me, for years, I didn't know that Leviticus 19 was quoted in Matthew 22 when they say love your neighbor as yourself, that was actually a exact quotation from Leviticus. And most people don't realize that because we don't teach that. We teach, or not we, but the church as a whole usually teaches Leviticus just for the clobber passages and then sometimes talking about sexual immorality. They don't use it for anything else. If they're using it as kind of like a parable talking about a certain thing. They'll relate back to Leviticus, but very rarely do they ever delve into the meaning of anything in Leviticus because it is so far from how we live our lives. You know, they back then they couldn't eat certain things, they couldn't wear certain things, they couldn't plant crops a certain way. But that's a very small part of Leviticus. Leviticus, in the broader sense, talks about justice and talks about the need to welcome in the stranger and the need to help the poor and the need to take care of all these things. And the church ignores all of that to focus on a small handful of verses, two of them in particular, which we call the clobber passages. And so it's sad that this entire book has basically been watered down because of the modern culture, watered down to just a couple of verses, and the important verses that are there aren't even mentioned. Now, we did talk last week about the chiastic structure of most of Leviticus, and basically that means that the beginning of Leviticus mirrors the ending of Leviticus, the next section mirrors the next to the last section, and then the middle section is the pinnacle of what everything's about, which is that statement to love your neighbor as yourself. All of the instructions for the Levites, all of the instructions on holiness, all of the instructions that are given all lead to this one central theme of loving your neighbor. And that's it. That's everything else builds to that. And the loving your neighbor as yourself is the centermost thing in the book of Leviticus. And that's scholars have debated that and talked about it. And it's crazy that that's the most important part. And that's the part that tends to be left out the most. So, moving on to verse 13. Does anybody want to? That's all catch up from last week, or just kind of to recap. Anybody want to say anything about that before we move on? Everybody good? Are we good? Okay. So Leviticus 20:13, ancient penalties. So as we said just a moment ago, there is this structure to where part of the verses mirror the other verses. So the beginning of the book mirrors the end, and the middle section mirrors the next to the last, with the center section being the most important. Leviticus 20 is actually a mirror verse to the Leviticus 18:22. So Leviticus 20:13 mirrors Leviticus 18:22. And basically, Leviticus 18:22 gives this list of things they don't want to occur, that are taboo, that are against their culture. But Leviticus 20 then comes back and gives a penalty for that list. And if you look at the verses around Leviticus 20:13, you'll notice that they line up with the verses that are from Leviticus 18. And each of them are given penalties. Now, it's interesting that this chapter or this verse is so highly focused on by churches, but they don't ever pay attention to the fact that the penalties are very, very harsh. And I have yet to see one person who committed adultery put to death. You know, I mean, it doesn't happen. But that's, if you read through the verses, that's what it says. And it's very emphatic on that. It's not something that, if you're truly reading this as exact truth that has to happen this certain way, then there are a lot of people that should be dead because of certain sins that they've done, if you're reading it in that context. So Leviticus 20:13 says, if a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them, and this is New International, it just happened to be the one I pulled up, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their heads. Now, there are people in the modern day church that still believe that. They still believe that if a person is caught in a homosexual relationship, then basically they're no better off. They might as well just be killed. I've seen people post on Facebook where they will respond to someone's comment and they'll say things like, your life would be better off if you were dead, or the world would be better off if you were dead. And people still have that mindset. But again, nobody ever pays attention to the fact that that verse is one of a whole long list of things that people would be killed for. They were to be put to death for disrespecting their parents. They were to be put to death for any multiplicity of things. And this is the one that people in many modern day churches still stand on. And I don't quite. That's why I don't believe it's a biblical thing to them. I believe it's a prejudice or a fear mongering thing. It's not something that is truly a biblical concept as much as it is a level of hatred and a level of anger on something they disagree with. And so these penalties, they were ancient penalties that protected their community's survival. The Israel was a tribal system. They were very small compared to the surrounding communities. And because of that, they had to remain separate. So if someone intermarried, or if someone allowed idols in, or if any of these things that were considered a death penalty, then that was a way of trying to eject out whatever this infringing thing was, whether it be idols or intermarrying into other cultures. And so to keep their identity and stability, they used the death penalty as one of the main ways of doing this. I mean, this was a very common thing, and that's actually common with other cultures as well. The Jews just happen to be the ones we're talking about. They also saw that as a type of remaining loyal to the covenant that God had given them. Because if they eliminated the things that were making them like the other nations, then they could truly have that covenant relationship with God. And it promoted the survival of their nation. Now, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, this was probably organized and put together in the time of the Babylonian Empire, the time of the Babylonian exile. And so the people had lost their nation. They had lost their culture. They had been removed from where they lived and taken to a completely different part of the world. They were losing their language. They lost the temple. And basically they felt like they were losing their identity. So anything they could do to try to maintain that identity was paramount for them. It was important for them to keep in mind the things that kept them separate. And so that makes sense on why they set up a lot of laws saying this happened and that happened and this has to be this way and that has to be this way. And as I said a moment ago, these particular verses have nothing to do with morality. They have to do with a pure bloodline, a purity, remaining separate from the outside cultures. Now, ancient penalties that were mentioned are things like, he shall surely be put to death, or they will be cut off from their people. Each of these penalties is for the purpose. It functioned as a covenant warning and a way of expelling that person from the culture, whether it be through death or through exile. And that was the only way they felt would keep their identity intact. Was anything that threatened their identity, they wanted to eliminate. Anything that made them feel like other people were infringing on their culture, they wanted to get rid of. And not being too political, but if we look in the culture of America today, we find the exact same situation, where there's so much going on where they try to expel people that are from different cultures and they feel like are going to destroy the Christian worldview that we have. So anyway, that being said, moving on from there, what's important though is to understand these were civil laws, not moral laws. These were civil choices, civil punishments, not something based on morality. Now, if Christians took this seriously, adulterers would be executed. Sabbath breakers, people who work on the Sabbath. Children who curse their parents would be executed. And mediums and spiritualists would be executed. I mean, that's. But there's no modern day Christian tradition that believes that. I mean, and I've been around where I grew up. There is a church organization. They're kind of like the Seventh Day Adventists, but they're not. They're a different type of organization. But they believe you can't have shellfish and you can't have this and that, and they're very strict on these dietary laws. But I know quite a few of them that have had extramarital affairs and things like that, and I've never seen one put to death. And it's crazy because they focus on these areas that really have nothing to do with anything, and they totally skip over these other things that are in the exact same line of restrictions. So now, we mentioned this last week, and we really focused on this a lot last week. Let me see. Well, okay, that may be my last slide. So we mentioned this last week that the main, I have this fly, Adam, so if you see me swatting, that's what it is. I promise I'm not losing my mind. Anyway, so the thing we talked about last week, one of the most important things we brought up was in the culture of the time, especially in the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and we even mentioned the Persians, which came right after the Babylonians. They had several different sexual related things that they didn't want to bleed over into the Jewish culture. For instance, they had fertility cults, which they would have large sexual orgies and things, all trying to promote fertility. They had temple prostitution of both men and women. They had idolatrous rituals that they would do that were sexual, that would be either men or women. And then there was the exploitative sexual systems, such as men who were Babylonian citizens who would have sex with their slaves and with their servants because they were on a different tier or a different caste. Basically, the Babylonian citizen was up here and these slaves were down here, so they could have sex with them and exploit them sexually, but they didn't feel like there was a problem with it because they were on two different levels. And so the Jewish people were very strongly speaking against these things. They didn't want them to get into using the fertility cult type practices, the temple prostitution, or the exploitation of others just for the act of sex. And it comes back to this sexual domination culture that we see, and it's actually been a very big thing throughout history, and we brought that up with Genesis 19. The fact of humiliating people through forced sex, the rape culture and things that many societies have had over time. And this was, again, something that was being seen in the time of Leviticus. And so people, the Levites especially, who were writing the book of Leviticus, were trying to keep this stuff from happening, trying to keep it from getting into the Jewish culture. Now, in the New Testament, it replaces the penalty system in like Acts, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. It basically dismantles this idea of putting people to death because of adultery or refusing to eat pork or all of these things, and it replaces it with holiness being defined as love instead of purity. The Old Testament idea of holiness was having a pure bloodline a set apart, pure lifestyle, and not pure in the nature of morality, but pure as in their actual context and their culture. But in the New Testament, all of that goes away, and it's all defined with this idea of love. And we see love as being the primary focus of the New Testament changes that we see from the Old Testament, New Testament. What's interesting is that's what Leviticus was saying. At Leviticus 19:18, when it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it was still about love, even in the Old Testament. But people had moved so far away from that they lost the idea of love and began focusing so much on what they could do to make themselves worthy of God's love, make themselves worthy to where they were considering themselves sinless and moral above others. And so this idea of love that even existed back in the time of Leviticus was lost by the time we get to the New Testament. And that's what Jesus was trying to bring back. Jesus was trying to bring this idea of loving one another. That's why he tells his disciples on multiple occasions that they will know you by your love, that you love one another. Talking about unity, and it's all about love. Talking about in the books of the Gospels, not Gospels of John, but the Epistles of John, actually stating that God, the essence of who God is love. So, okay, with that, Leviticus, well, before I say that, any comments? Do y'all want to say anything about that before we move on?
Well, I just find it interesting that it goes back to the whole idea of love and how far it's easily construed to something else rather than the object of love, which, God was kind of trying to convey, I think, in these scriptures. So what do you think is the reason that it was, I guess maybe the nature of humanity to self-satisfying and in a way to make sure that they're valid, I guess, in scripture? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yeah, or at least I think I'm understanding you. So, in my thought is it is much easier for a person to do something that can be seen by others and make themselves look more holy or more important, more self-righteous. But love, you don't really see love in the aspect of you do someone refusing to eat pork or walking around with ashes on their head and burlap clothes on. I mean, there are ways that the people they it was easier for them to follow this set of rules than it would be to just love somebody that they disagreed with. Does that answer the statement that you said?
Yeah.
Okay, so and I truly believe, and I believe that's something Jesus mentioned to the Pharisees a lot, was the fact that they were not showing love. Instead, they would rather not heal on the Sabbath day, but healing on the Sabbath day was showing love. They would not feed the hungry, or they would tell their parents, oh, I'm not actually giving this to you as a gift. I'm giving it to God as a gift. You're just the recipient. And they were totally rejecting or removing the love from it and focusing on a set of rules and traditions because that was easier. And it was easier to quantify, I think. It's easier to check off a list of rules than it is to say, I love someone enough to take them clothes when they're in prison, or to feed the poor, or to take care of the widow and the orphan. And even today, I mean, I feel like that's a very common thing in the modern day church. There's a lot of people that they have all of these really strict religious rules that they follow, but they miss out on the important part of showing love for another person and being willing to be there to help and to bring comfort in the time of grief and feeding them when they're hungry and things like that. So it's much easier to quantify this list of rules than it would be just showing love for other people. Any other comments or anything before we? Everybody good?
No,
Okay.
I
Okay.
guess I wonder, and I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm definitely not making a coherent point, but um, like it's easy to think about these are codes that are set aside to distinguish one group of people from another group of people, and the other group of people is going to have temple prostitution where there's exploitation, and we don't want to be associated with that. But also, I mean, we may have only had words and definitions for a relatively short period of time, but sexual orientation diversity and gender identity diversity has existed forever.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people in their society who were gay, but also like I don't know what their society. I mean, it's really easy to say this is just talking about temple prostitution, but it's also hard to say like, okay, but what about the people that lived through this? And I wonder if people were actually put to death. You know, like it's a devastating thing to think about.
And you're right. And there were probably those occasions which someone, in the fact of someone was put to death because of engaging in sexual contact. Now, the one thing, at least I hope, I'm because there was the hierarchical type sexual deviance where you would have sex with another man of the same status as a way to humiliate him, but it was okay to have sex with someone who was a slave. I'm I really feel like that there's a possibility that that could have gone on in the Jewish culture and they didn't think anything about it because it wasn't the actual exploitation of another person of the same level. And we know how they felt about slaves and servants. I mean, they were property. I mean, even women were considered property, which we'll actually talk about before we're done today. You know, individuals who were thought of as less than whatever they felt like a man was. These individuals, they felt it was okay, and so I'm hoping that there wasn't many people put to death because of this, just for the fact of them having a love relationship with another man. Um, I also believe, and I believe we see this in other cultures, there are a lot of times that, especially in a culture that's small or a community that's small, the men would marry a woman so that they could still procreate, but then would have their male to male relationship as with other people so that they would have pleasure without procreation. And so I feel like that probably occurred in the Jewish culture and it wasn't mentioned because it was accepted. The only things that are mentioned are things that are not accepted. And that's why in this particular passage, which that leads us really good into this passage. So Leviticus 20, it starts out with child sacrifice, talks about mediums and spiritualists being holy, and then it brings up things like incest, having sex with people who are like in-laws, like mother-in-law, adultery, and then male to male domination. That's the big issue. It's the issue. It's about penetration, and we talked about that last week. It comes from the fact of who is receiving and who is giving. I mean, and so if the Jewish man was basically the giver of the sexual situation, without getting too far into it, he wouldn't be condemned as much as he would be if he put himself as the female or the receiver side. And that's why the men were allowed to have sex with their slaves, because the slaves they were subordinate. They weren't as important. And so because of that, they played a different role and they weren't thought of in the same hierarchy of social status. And So he's telling them, or the people who have put this all together, is warning them about this hierarchical type mindset and this exploiting people for sex, and then the ritualized sex, and the status-based sex of forcing individuals, as a way of humiliation and a way of trying to force them to um, be less than what they are. So with these taboo violations, and the other thing is these are taboo violations. These are we want to keep this so it separates us from the other people. And things like incest is kind of an abuse of power, because incest and rape and things like that are power issues. They're not just a sexual issue, but it's a power issue. Exploitation is the same thing. It's a power issue. Um, Child sacrifice, that would be something to where the child wasn't able to make the choice of, do I want to be sacrificed? And so again, it's this destabilization of their society. Um, and then when you get to adultery and the type of exploitative type male sexual intimacy, it dealt with humility and humiliation, and treating people in ways that they didn't need to be treated. And so this caused a lot of issues with the Jewish people, or at least that's the way it appears. And so he tells them, the writer, I keep saying he, but the writers, when they put this together, is telling them, don't imitate these other nations. Don't act like these other nations, because they have male concubines. They have what they call court favorites, which were basically the king's male escort. Then the sexual, ritual sex, and status-based domination, when free men humiliating other men. These were things that were common in other cultures, and so they didn't want that to be something that came around in the Jewish culture, because then they would be no different than the surrounding nations. And so in many ways, it all comes back to power. It comes back to the people and how they perceived power and how they perceived manliness. And when you're dealing with a patriarchal type system, you deal with power and people, men are supposed to be this way, women are supposed to be this way. And so it all comes back to this idea of giving up their power, allowing themselves to be dominated, allowing themselves to be submissive to someone else. And that is a form of giving up power. And it actually words it, a man lying with a man as he would with a woman. And so to the Jews, this was a role reversal thing. It's taking a man and saying a man is nothing better than a woman. And it's sad, but that was their mindset. That women were their status was much lower than men's status. In many cases, women were considered property. And so if you have one man dominating another, then you basically say this man is no better than a woman. So you're lowering him socially, you're lowering his status, and now you're treating a free man like a subordinate. And that was a major issue. They felt like, just like they didn't want people to be humiliated through forced sex, they didn't want men to be treated as if they were on a lower level, because it was common. It was something that we've talked about in the last two lessons as well, that it was something that they would do as a way of humiliation for another person. And so these prohibitions from chapter 18 are seen as penalties here in chapter 20. And they are again talking about identity and overcoming identity. Now, before we move on to talking about the the lack of there being a female part of this, any other comments or anything before we move to the next part? Are y'all good, everybody?
Well, I mean, with what you just said, that definitely I can see how there would be no need for to talk about a female to female issue because of the hierarchical stance or whatever you call it in that time. And another thing that, just to say, piggyback off what you were saying, is when you kept saying, what would you say? Instead of the hierarchy or the power, when you were saying power, I also see that as authority and people having authority over another person. And it just brings back the idea of consent as what I'm hearing
Yes.
when you're saying, when you're talking about this. And so if the lower person does not have or gives consent or has the authority or power to give consent, then that would make them lesser of than that person that was doing those types of sexual acts. So
And that's, yes, you're exactly right. And that's the one thing we see when we read this, is it's not talking about a consensual, mutual love relationship. It's talking about a male dominating power over another person. And it has nothing to do with gender. It has nothing to do with what we think of as gender. It has to do with this male domination, and whoever the subordinate is, they don't have the choice. Just like the women, and I have actually heard sermons to where pastors have said women basically don't have the right to choose. There's no such thing as marital rape, and that women, if her husband wants sex, then they should just give it to him. And I mean, that's even today there are people that have that mindset. Adam, did you have something to say?
Oh no, I don't see how any in that society, I don't see how any sex at all can be something that would be pleasing to God. Like when consent can't exist,
Yeah.
then how can you consider any sexual act moral at all? And it's just bizarre to me that you would think the only people who would have the ability to consent to each other would be two people who are at the top, and we're gonna say that that's the most
Yeah.
impure.
Yeah.
It's
No,
ridiculous.
and you're absolutely right. It is. It's crazy because, like I said, even people in the modern church still kind of have that mindset of that men, they're the powerful ones, they're the ones that should receive. It doesn't really matter what anybody else wants as long as they're getting their way, and it is. It's a sad place that a society would be like that, And so the Jews, they were at that day and time, they were very much male chauvinist and misogynistic, to where they focused on the men. The women didn't matter. The slaves didn't matter. Foreigners didn't matter whenever it came to things like this, because they were all considered less. And it's interesting because if you see or you pay attention through the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, God is constantly telling them not to treat foreigners as beneath them, not to treat these people as beneath them, but they still did. It was something that was very common and with their society. And so looking at the female issue, because there have been those questions that come up. Well, why does it only mention male to male? Well, the reason is because women were not considered, they weren't considered important. They weren't considered an equal status with the men. And so they didn't care what happened to the women. If the women wanted to have, pillow partners or whatever, that was fine, as long as it wasn't involving this domination from one man dominating another. And women didn't have the same status in public. They basically were the head of the household, or not head of the household, but like the caretaker of the house. They didn't have the same social status as men, to where they could make choices and own property. And when they did, technically, when they were married, then they would lose that status of like property owner, and it would go to their husband. And so it was such a male-centered social order that to them, all that mattered was that one man basically isn't forcing another man into a sexual encounter. And people of the same status, men, not talking about the slaves. And so that male on male act is strictly talking about this humiliation, this sexual dominance of one person forcing another person to have sex with them. Women's sexuality was basically controlled through marriage. There was not a law having to decide, okay, if women want to do this or that. Women were expected to be virgins. Women were expected not to commit adultery. There were certain household boundaries. And what's interesting to me is which men were expected not to commit adultery either, but it wasn't taken as seriously by the people with men as it was with women. And we see that in the New Testament. And my thought is, how is a man going to have adultery if they're not wanting them to have these like dominated type male relationships? How are they going to have adultery with someone that's not a woman? So there's always going to be a woman in the picture, but then they're saying for the woman it's worse than it is for the man. And the man, like when the woman was brought to Jesus, they brought the woman to Jesus. They didn't bring the man to Jesus. They didn't say, hey, here's this man caught in adultery. Can we stone them? It was, here's this woman caught in adultery. And so women were constantly being reminded of their worth and their value, and how they weren't treated with the same respect as men were. And in much of the same way, these other, like the male concubines, the court favorites, those individuals, they were also seen as being less because they weren't seen as being a citizen of Israel, or a citizen of Babylon, or whoever they were, whatever country they were in. And so because of that, it went back to that patriarchal type, hierarchical type system. And people were being forced to do things that normally we would think of. They needed to have consent to do it. So if that makes sense, I kind of got stumbling over what I said there. So, okay, so all of this being said, and this is where it all comes back to, and I know we're coming up on the end, it all comes back to this one issue. Leviticus, the first two sections of Leviticus and the final two sections of Leviticus all come together to focus on this one center concept. And as we said earlier, that center concept is loving other people. And when we're talking about these type of relationships, these weren't love-oriented relationships. These, the male on male dominance, the men forcing their slaves into exploitation, these were not love relationships. These were things to do with power, to do with manliness, to do with their own ideas, and it had nothing to do with love. And in today's society, when we look at orientation, we're not looking at an issue of someone just wanting power or someone wanting to force humiliation. It's done as an act of love and companionship and consent and a mutual arrangement between another person. And I know there's kinks and stuff you can get into. I'm not talking about that. But it's things in this case that these individuals in the Jewish culture back in the day, they were focused on this issue of power, when today sexuality has nothing to do with power. And Adam, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I didn't mention it earlier, but we mentioned it last week. There were priests in the Babylonian Empire that were basically non-binary. They were either female priests that were male in appearance, or male priests that were female in appearance. Individuals who were fluid with their gender. And so that was something that's happened throughout history. That's not just a modern today thing. Now, we may have a definition for it today that they didn't have back in 500 BCE, or 5000 BCE, but it's something that's always existed. It's always been there. Every major culture has had those non-binary type, agendered people. And so looking at it from today's standards of people throwing a fit about it, it really blows my mind, because they make such a big deal about someone who's always been there. They just never were acknowledged and never seen that way. So, All of that being said, that's basically everything I have talking about the books of Leviticus. Next week, we'll be talking about the next chapter, which is found in the book of Romans. And we'll be looking at how that actually compares to extra biblical writings, because the passage in Romans is actually taken from a source outside of the Bible, and it was used by Paul as kind of an example there, and we'll talk more about that next week. So, do you guys have anything else you want to say? I did send that email with the link to the Bible studies. So on my personal YouTube, to the email, so that y'all can, like, if the lady who was here, if they want to see the one from last week, it'll be on there, and this one as well. So
Also, just thinking about Leviticus and as a whole, and why was Leviticus written? Can you talk a little bit about that?
okay, so the book of Leviticus, basically the first 5 books of the Bible, and modern inerrantist type Christians who believe that every word of the Bible is direct, God given word of God. A lot of people still try to say, oh, well, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were all written by Moses, given to the Jews before they entered into the area of Canaan. That's been the contemporary traditional understanding. But when we read the books of 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles, especially the end chapters, we find out that there was a king by the name of Josiah. And Josiah went into the temple, had people go into the temple to clean it because it had basically been in disarray and all of these problems were going on. So they went into the temple and they found all of these scrolls, all of this writing. And so following that, he had people put together basically the law. And the Bible tells us this, but people don't equate that to being the first 5 books of the Bible. They just say, oh, well, that was it they were talking about. Well, basically, in my viewpoint, and from what I've learned from reading about scholars, they usually believe this as well, that most likely following Josiah discovering all those parchments, they formulated the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Leviticus specifically talking about from the Jewish priests version, while the other books weren't focusing so much on the priests, but the Levites, the Levitical people, they put together this book to help keep the people focused on their own identity, their own belief system, so they didn't fall into all of these other cultures. And so I believe, and from everything that I've learned, that's what I believe the book of Leviticus was written for. And the time frame it was written was much, much later than what a lot of people try to say. Even right before, I mean, like the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's much later in the history of the Jewish people. So, well, anything else? No, we're good. Okay. Well, hey guys, I
Same time,
appreciate
same
y'all.
place next week.
Yes, same time, same time.